What's up everybody, welcome back to another tutorial from Mule Made Easy. Today, we're going to be going over the validation component in Mule 4. Let's check it out. Just as a real quick overview of what we're going to be going over in this video today, we're going to be talking about what validators are, how can we use them, and how can we use them in tandem with exception handling strategies like the try-catch block to get a little more out of them. So validators are used to verify that parts of the Mule message meet some kind of criteria that we specify. These criteria can be very specific or they can be very general. Like some specific ones are whether or not a part of the message is an email, whether or not it's at an IP, and then some more general ones like is it a collection or not, or an empty collection or not, is it null, a blank string, and the most general one, is it true or false? Let's get into a demo and see how this works. Alright, so this is the demo application that I've set up. Very simple. We have a main flow here, which contains an HTTP listener as the event source. This is listening on localhost 8081 on the path trigger. We have a flow reference here that references get database records, and this is just to be there to act as a mock of actually querying the database. So let's add a record real quick. We'll call it, let's say it's field 1 and the value is 1. Something really simple. And after that we have a logger that says validations passed. So let's actually add our validator. To add the validator, you'll come over here to the Mule palette, you'll start to type in validation, and you'll see this large list of potential validators that we could use. In this case, we want to implement a very simple use case, and one that's pretty typical as well, where we're expecting records to come back from a database, and we want to verify that we've actually received some records. So in this case, we want to validate that the database is not returning an empty collection. So we'll use this validation is not empty collection, drag this over to the canvas right after the flow reference, and you should see the configuration information pop up at the bottom there. Let's go over what that means, what these things mean briefly. The two most important parts in the general tab are general for values and error options message. Now, values basically determines what part of this Mule message are we going to run through this validation. What part of the message do we want to make sure is not an empty collection? In this case, it's the payload, but it could be anything like a variable, for instance, as well. And what it's going to do is it's going to get whatever value payload represents, and it's going to check if it's not an empty collection. If that check evaluates to true, we're going to pass the validation, and the Mule will just continue processing the message. However, if it's false, Mule will throw an exception. Another really important field here is the message field. The reason this is so important is because it gives us an opportunity as application developers to provide end users with a really useful error message. So in this case, since we're checking to make sure we're receiving records back from the database, we're going to say something like did not receive records from the database. How about did not receive any records? All right, the next tab that you'll probably be most interested in is the error mapping tab. So this kind of allows us to do something in the same spirit as setting the message. And that is we can take something application specific like the error type and map it to something that's more application specific. Or not application specific, but something that the end user would appreciate a little more. They don't really care about a validation empty collection error type. So let's go ahead, or it could just be confusing. So we're going to go ahead and click this. That's the error type that we want to map from. And we want to map this to the app namespace, and the identifier, we'll call it no DB records. Actually, let's not specify that we're using a DB or a database because the end user doesn't really need to know about that. So we'll just say no records found. And keeping with that spirit in mind, instead of database, we'll say data source and kind of abstract away the reality that we're using a database on the back end. All right, so now that that's all configured, we're going to go ahead and run this. But before we do, let's think about what might happen. So we'll trigger this flow. We will get the database records, which will return a array with one map in it, with one field as well. That'll get set to the payload. We will validate that the payload is not an empty collection. So when we do, is the payload an empty collection, if we evaluate that, it's going to be, when we evaluate is the payload not an empty collection, that's going to evaluate to true. So we're going to pass this through, and we should see that it logs that the validations were passed. I already had this running. I'm going to go ahead and trigger Postman off screen. And validations passed. So that made it through okay. Let's find out what happens when we don't pass the validation and it throws an error instead. So we'll go to the database results. We'll just delete the record that we added there. And we'll save this. Mule should reboot for us. Awesome. And I'm going to trigger this off screen again. Okay, so here we saw that validation, or that log message never got logged because we never made it to that point in the flow because an exception was thrown from the validation component. You can see that the messages did not receive any records from the data source. You can see it added that period on the end for us like I was saying earlier. Just keep in mind that it does that. Let's go back to the console. The error type here is validation empty collection. And we do have the error mapping that we specified here as well. Now, let's take a look at Postman real quick because there's a few shortcomings with how we're doing things right now. First of all, we're receiving a 500 server error. This might not be ideal. A lot of times, let's assume that our end user is passing in an ID to get a specific record from the database, and we didn't find that record. That's actually not, probably wouldn't map as a 500 internal error because everything happened fine on the application side, but when we have a user that's requesting a resource that doesn't exist, that's an error on their side. So we want to pass back a 404 instead. In addition to this, it would be nice if we can pass back something that's machine readable and not just plain text. So we're going to try to pass back application JSON instead. And we'll also try to grab that error type if we can. So let's give that a shot. So the first thing we want to do is make sure that what is returned is a JSON response. So if we go into the HTTP listener, and we go to responses. This is our positive responses, and down here we have our error responses. So the body, we can see that it's grabbing the error description, but it's bringing it back in text.plain, or text/plain rather, and we're more interested in something machine readable like application JSON. So we actually want to make this a JSON object. We'll say the error is error description. In addition to this, I remember that we said we wanted to add the actual error type as well. So we'll say error type, and we'll say error dot error type. I love this autocomplete. I would have made that mistake of just calling it type if that wasn't there. Okay. In addition to that, we want to set the status code to 404. But first, let's just check to make sure this is working as expected. We'll save that. It'll reboot one more time. Let's see, pull up Postman right here. We'll send it off again. And awesome. So we get our error type, no records found. We get the namespace and all that. But we're still getting this 500 error. So let's go ahead and minimize this. And think about how we could potentially set that error to a 404. One way to do it would be to go to the responses, again the error responses, and just type in 404 here. That'll get the job done just fine, as we can verify after this reboots. I'll call this one more time. We'll see we got that 404 not found status, and that's great. However, the shortcoming to doing it this way is that we don't have any flexibility. Let's say it actually was a 500 error, and we wanted it to be a 404, or we wanted to actually be a 500 error returned to the client, but instead we've hard-coded this 404. So how can we get around that? The first thing we need to do is enable the HTTP listener to dynamically define that. And we're going to do that by putting an expression here, much like what we have in the body. So we'll do output. In this case, it's fine if it's application Java, because this is just going to be a number or a string. We'll do those 3 dashes. And in this case, we'll get something, we'll actually grab a variable that we set during the course of the flow, and we'll call this variable HTTP status. Now, it could be the case that this variable never gets set because we didn't anticipate an exception condition or something like that. So let's go ahead and give it a default value of 500 because that's our bad if we're not catching these errors, and we'll go from there. So now that we have that set up, what we need to do is actually set that HTTP status variable. And what we can do to do that is we want to respond to when this particular validation component fails and throws an exception. And we can do that in multiple ways, but the way we're going to do it here is by using a try-catch block. So during error handling, we'll add on error propagate, and we can, or propagate rather, I always say propagate, and we can grab the exceptions here instead. So what's nice here is we can hit this magnifying glass over here and specify the type of the exception that we want to catch with this particular error handler. We want app no records found. And then finally, we just want to set that var HTTP status to a 404 instead of the 500. So let's actually say what that variable is called. All right, I'm going to save this real quick, and before we actually look at what happens, let's walk through how this is going to work. HTTP listener is going to trigger this flow. Get database records is going to be called. We're going to get back an empty collection, an empty array rather. This is going to go into the try-catch block where we have this validator to check that it's not an empty collection. It is an empty collection, so this is going to throw an exception. Now that exception is going to be a validation empty collection type, and it's going to be mapped to the app no records found. When that gets thrown, it will get caught by this on error propagate, and which is set up to catch app no records found exceptions. So it'll execute whatever is in that particular error handler. In this case, we're setting the HTTP status to 404. Since it's not continuing, we're never going to hit this validation pass. It's actually just going to return back to the HTTP client. And when it does, since we have an error response, this code is going to start executing. We're going to specify our error type and our error in the body of the response. And we're also going to set the status code to whatever we set for that variable HTTP status. And if that variable is not set, or it evaluates to something that isn't a valid expression and it crashes, we'll default to 500 because that's our bad. So let's go ahead. I believe I already saved this, so let's go ahead and run it. All right, so we get our message here. And awesome, so we get our 404 not found. So that's exactly what we're looking for. Let's validate that the non-happy path doesn't work. So let's say we set this to HTTP status is instead of status. We did that incorrectly. We should get a 500 back. Let's wait for this to reboot. We'll go to Postman, send it off, and it defaults to that 500 just like we wanted. All right, that concludes the video today on the Mule 4 validation component. If you liked the video and like to see some more content like this in the future, feel free to like it and subscribe. If you'd like to follow us on Twitter at MuleMadeEasy as well, that'd be great. You can get some information from there too. Like always, the final code for this tutorial will be in GitHub in the description below. I'll see you next time.